You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Oh là là, il fait chaud.
That means, ooh la la, it's hot. Bonjour everyone, Liling here, back from vacation in France, where the Paris Olympics has been in full swing, along with the erratic weather that went from stormy start to intense heat, and then over the weeks peppered by heat warnings and storm alerts. I'm solo hosting today without co-host Jack Board, who is taking his turn to go on holiday, hopefully somewhere with less punishing weather. And that's what's on the agenda this episode, grueling, punishing weather. In Paris, athletes have been braving the heat that's gone up to as high as 37 degrees Celsius, and fans have had to bake under full-on sun exposure for open-air events. Our correspondent in France, Ross Cullen, spoke to a few of them.
We were sat in the direct sun for like 3 hours watching the basketball, but yeah, an ice cream afterwards helped.
So it's been really hot here, very sweaty.
What's the weather like here?
It's not just France and the Olympic athletes and fans wrestling with this weather, though. Here in our part of the world, things are also heating up. And we're putting the spotlight on a very different group of people dealing with the brunt of it. They are our workers laboring in the elements, migrant workers at construction sites, landscapers and gardeners tending to urban greenery, painters and cleaners, and people whose livelihoods require that they work outdoors. And with temperatures breaking records in Singapore, what risks do these folks face, and what options are there to cool down and keep safe? Here with me to answer these questions is Associate Professor Jason Lee, who is also the Director of the Heat Resilience and Performance Center at the Yong School of Medicine at NUS. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for joining us here today. Now, Dr. Lee, if I understand correctly, your field is physiology, and you study the impact of heat stress on the human body to find ways to limit the impact and improve performance and productivity. Now, we recently saw that on 21st July, the planet recorded its hottest day ever. It's certainly feeling a lot hotter here in Singapore. What does all this mean for Singapore and the region and the people here?
It means we'll get more and more uncomfortable. And it really depends who you are. For most of us, we can avoid the heat. And we thought, okay, since we have aircon, cooling facilities, and therefore we are not paying the price of a warming world. No, in fact, we are paying the price indirectly. Lack of incidental physical activity, lack of outdoor exposure, which means our physical health, mental health, even eye health will be compromised. But there are other sectors like the workers who don't have a choice to avoid the heat. And they still have to toil out there. And the usual concern in that sector is there could be increased heat injuries, severe work productivity losses. And then when you are uncomfortable, right? If I put you in the context where you are too hot, too cold, too noisy, too smelly, the default human response is, I want to finish the work and get out of here as soon as possible. And therefore, our decision-making can also be compromised, leading to accidents at workplaces. No? So we are after heat injury, productivity loss, and then decision-making leading to the increase in accidents.
Yeah, speaking of accidents, this really is a matter of life and death, isn't it? We had the case last year, I believe, of a migrant worker who fell from the roof of a 7-story building. I think that one got a lot of attention. And the coroner said it was likely because he was disoriented from the heat. We're talking about not just the impact on our physical health from the heat stress, but all these other repercussions from it. How bad is this situation? What is the clear and present danger?
Yeah, if I may, just to speculate on that case, of course, we didn't measure him during that incident, but basic physiology tell us when you get hot, right, immediately you will need to shunt your blood onto the skin to dissipate it onto the environment. And then if that is insufficient, we usually need to sweat to fight the heat. So there is this vasodilation, there is this increase in sweating. And hopefully if the environment is dry enough, you can evaporate the sweat and therefore you lose the heat. Okay, in our context, the latter is also compromised because you can sweat, but it doesn't mean you can evaporate all your sweat, and therefore your heat will be building up continuously. continuously. So in that case, it's not difficult to speculate when you have an individual, and remember that individual wasn't a young man, so probably have limited physiological capacity. So when the blood gets shunned to the skin to lose the heat, right, there could be a drop in blood pressure, and then you get lightheaded, and then you could fall off. That happens quite commonly in other contexts where you go to onsens and sauna, you experience the acute experience is post that the experience you feel some lightheadedness because the blood now is being shunned to the skin, and you experience that acute lightheadedness. In most cases, you sit, you lie down, but in few cases, you didn't have a chance and you collapse. And then in this case, he fell from height.
What specific risks do construction workers, migrant workers face that most of us cannot fully appreciate?
If we now zoom into occupational workers, right, there are two types of work in general. One is what we call a salaried, you are paid by time. As long you are there long enough, you get pay. And in that case, most of the time you expect huge productivity loss, because there's no motivation for them to work harder because they get the same pay. And you will definitely suffer huge productivity losses. In fact, in Project Heat Safe that just concluded, it was a 3.5 years project. We found there's a lot of productivity implications because you tend to slow down when you are uncomfortable. But when we went to South Korea and profiled a group of workers, they were delivering job and they were paid by piece. The ambient conditions were much milder than what we experienced in Singapore. In Singapore, hovering about 30 plus and minus. In South Korea, then it was 20. And we're surprised the physiological strain was much higher in those workers working in cooler conditions. Why? Because they were paid by piece and therefore had the intrinsic motivation to work as hard as possible. When you work as hard as possible, that is where you produce a lot of heat, resulting in the hot human body. Also, a point to emphasize is it's not always the case that hot environment means a hot human. It depends on the context.
Oh, wow. So it cannot be looked at in isolation, lah. That's what you're saying, just the heat.
That's right.
The heat temperature alone.
Broadly, what equates a hot worker as a function of the environment, the attire, and the work. So environment is just one factor. We need to account for the attire and the type of work.
Singapore's Manpower Ministry last year imposed heat safety rules that employers need to follow. These include regular breaks, a lot of water and hydration, a place to cool down. But in a recent news report, the ministry said nearly 30% of some 250 work sites inspected in the second quarter of the year did not have those measures in place. Fines were imposed on some of them, but should penalties be heavier in order to actually get these rules implemented?
The recommendations made last year, they call it enhanced heat measures. There's a list of things, but you mentioned a few. Get yourself heat acclimatize, rest, drink, and when you rest under shade. These are evidence-based options. And also, we don't have to innovate for the sake of innovation. They are proven solutions. In this case, very low cost, very sustainable. We just say that, do this because your body temperature can recover and therefore you can be more productive. To your point on whether we should punish eventually, well, there's always a space for that. But before that, I think there is still room for us to increase the awareness why we are talking about providing these measures. Because I think you talk about rest, right? Immediately the employer would assume, say, more rest, yes, more welfare, but bad business. I think that's the number one thing we need to debunk.
Okay.
Because in Project Heat Safe, we found when we introduce more rest, productivity increases. Remember, a lot of these workplaces are not paid by time, i.e. they are not paid by piece, right? So if you don't give them rest, humans are very creative. I can slow down. I can go to the toilet in higher frequency. No one's going to stop me. So I'll find ways to rest. Huge presenteeism occur in workplaces. So I think, number one, we need to increase awareness, convince the boardroom, say that when we introduce heat measures, it's not just welfare, it's for good business. So if everyone believes and convinced, right, it's good for welfare, good for business, right, I would assume most will come on board. So I think that 30% that didn't, right, is because number one, they probably didn't appreciate, said no. At the end of it, it's bottom line. We need to profit. There are other priorities, no. So I cannot afford to give more rest. Number two, you have to see it from a recipient's perspective. We are saying now, if you don't do this, right, there's a risk of getting heat injured. If I'm the worker, if I'm the delivery man, I'll say, you're talking about risk, Jason. I'm talking about if I don't deliver more, right, it's not risk. I will earn less at the end of the day, So I'm willing to take the risk. And also from a behavioral and implementation sciences consideration, I think we need to incorporate that. We cannot assume when there are solutions, humans will use the solutions. So you must create a value why they should respond to these enhanced policies. If not, I think the mindset will be, wow, this is a new set, then they will do the audit, they will check us out. I think the spirit of which we conduct this will be wrong. I think there is still room for us to augment, may not be 100%, but I think there's still this 30% of poor adherence we can continue to reduce.
So 30% of poor adherence. Do you think the onus then should be on the companies or the individual?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the individuals must first understand, because at the end of it, when we talk about heat injury, right, it goes down to the last man. That he must be aware if there are signs, I must take actions. But they will tell you, I don't have the resources to incorporate all these measures, so my supervisors or employers have to be responsible. And therefore, going back to my earlier point, we must create a value why they should react in the first place.
So you talked about simple, low-cost solutions to regulating body temperature. But what about long-term innovative solutions that could be viable?
So assuming the proven solutions like getting yourself aerobically fit, heat acclimatized, optimizing your work rest cycle, cooling and appropriate hydration are in place, and we find that, it is still not enough, right? That is where it gives us a motivation. Maybe innovation can fill the gap. So there work on automation. Do we need that labor-intensive efforts every time that can come in? Specific to heat management, the Workplace Safety and Health Institute also tested out the provision of ice slushy. Okay, not the Slurpee we get at the 7-Eleven, right? Those are high in sugar.
Yeah.
But you can say pour any kind of sports drink that usually low in sugar with some electrolyte. It makes wonderful, tasty ice slushy. So they have trialed that. The science is convincing, and the biggest takeaway from that testing by WSHI was the workers like it so much. They said if this were to be implemented, they will pay for it. Today, how it works in workplaces, they get their drinks from the vending machine. They pay $1 and then they get it. So we're asking for vendors to come on board to say, now can those vending machine also dispense ice slurries? There's also a concept, especially from insights from Project Heat Safe. We found actually most of the workers were okay in terms of a physiological screen. In fact, as an average mean group response, right, we found that if anything, they were underworking, which takes the general impression if you're not paid by piece, right, I would slow down to preserve my health. And therefore, there's huge productivity implications. Having said that, there were few individuals who were pushing the limits physiologically. And these are the individuals, they could be more vulnerable. They could be, for whatever reason, very motivated individuals. Even I'm not paid by piece, right? I'm just a motivated worker. I will give all out. And their physiological strain were dangerously high, above 39 degrees Celsius while working, for example. So from an innovation perspective, we are exploring whether we can first profile the group of workers who are more vulnerable to heat stress. There's this concept called the heat vulnerability index that incorporates a lot of inputs parameters, your age, whether you are on medication, so on and so forth, and give you a score. So imagine we have that, then we picked out these 5 guys out of 100 who are already more vulnerable. We could layer heart rate monitoring. That's another innovative approach, right? There are proven heart rate solutions there. And then develop that threshold individually. So when I know you cross a certain number, your heart rates, for example, I can pull you out. By doing so, right, you picked out those who are high risk. Then you can use this also to say, oh, actually, they are a group that is not pushing hard enough. They want to because they have more physiological reserve to do so. So the whole work model can also be revisited. Maybe there's some more intensive work. You can segment them. Since you are healthier, you can push more. I will group you and you get paid more. And those who are not so strong, maybe they are okay not to be over pushed. So especially when the manpower is shrinking, right? We need to job fit every worker in a more targeted manner and don't assume everyone is the same.
In terms of a lot of these migrant workers, the issue for them isn't just outdoors, though, right? Dormitories are also an area of concern, given the number of people who are housed in an enclosed area. Air conditioning rooms is also often too costly, not an option, and not very climate friendly either. So space is a real issue. What can we do, or what can companies do to better manage this indoor heat factor?
Yeah, that's a important point, right? Because our life is not just during the work exposure. We assume when we come home, in this case, to the dormitories, they'll be well rested. Most of the dorms, based on my knowledge, are not air conditioned. I think for the right reason also. Aircon, by the way, is a great invention. It's the allocation of aircon, like a lot of other big ticket items in our society, is just disproportionately allocated. Usually the most vulnerable don't have access to all the bells and whistles. But coming back to the conversations, we need to also ensure they rest well at night. And thermal discomforts will degrade your sleep quality and sometimes duration. This is all the more relevant in our context where the recent V3 projection says that by mid-century, the scary statement is there that based on best case scenario, so we don't have to imagine it will happen, almost every night will be a warm night. So not rocket science. If you don't recover well, you keep on working over days, over weeks, right? Then when you return to work next day, you don't expect you are fully sound, and therefore there's a higher risk, right? Not just productivity losses, your concentration, therefore accidents, and plus the cumulative work exposure, right? I think things will turn even worse if you don't ensure sufficient recovery at rest. So that is another segment through Project HEAT, right? In collaboration with overseas partner, we are also now looking at the dormitories condition and approaching the fan first approach. Design the dormitories to make sure that we can optimize thermal comfort while they are resting.
And earlier you also touched on air conditioning, which really isn't the solution. And what struck me was that, as I mentioned earlier, I just came back from France, and I don't know if you've been there. In the dead heat of summer, it gets so hot that it's almost like the weather here. But this is not an air-conditioned country. So it's not like you can just run into a shopping centre or go back home or your hotel or Airbnb and turn on the aircon. So for about 2 weeks, we had no aircon. And then I came back to Singapore and I had acclimatized. And it really struck me how 2 weeks away without aircon, and you're back in Singapore and you feel like there's less of this dependence or addiction to it. And it just became a really tangible way for me to think about, maybe I don't need to use my aircon so much. As somebody in your field, do you look at how people can acclimatize better?
Yeah. In fact, you have just unintentionally put yourself through 2 weeks of heat acclimatization and you're feeling the benefits, right? If I got to deal with this stressor called heat, right, then I expose myself, and in this case, exactly 2 or 3 weeks. That is actually the same recommendation, 2 or 3 weeks of exposure to heat will induce certain physiological responses and also behavior responses for you to better deal with heat. So you have increased skin blood flow, you have increased sweat loss. These are all favorable physiological adaptations. You also know how to pace yourself better upon exposure to heat. And you say, Singapore, after 2 weeks, surprisingly, is not as hot because it was hotter elsewhere. The key difference between these two contexts is a population that only deal with heat in France, right, every summer. Whereas in Singapore, we deal with heat. So our behavior response is already quite attuned. Not so much that we will face the heat because we are living in the tropics, especially in Singapore, coupled with the aircon facilities almost everywhere, right? We are quite good in avoiding the heats too by hiding in your malls, cooling facilities. So actually most Singaporeans are actually not as physiologically heat acclimatized as many assume. When we travel, they say, you're from Singapore, you must be tropical heat acclimatized.
No,
not true.
we're a bit spoiled.
We are very good in avoiding the heat, and we thought, and therefore look at our epidemiological evidence or data, we hardly have any heat stroke death. And that has been the exact reason why for the longest time we have not taken urgent action, because usually we see heat news is somebody dying, summer heat waves, France. But in Singapore, we don't have, therefore heat is not a problem. And we explain because we are very used to heat. We are very used to heat in Singapore because we have options to avoid the heat. And that itself will incur a lot of indirect implications, lack of incidental physical activity outdoor. Your activity count, you must almost like proportion time for it, right? You cannot say, no, this morning I just walked 5K to work. No, it won't happen in Singapore because you will get uncomfortable. Mental health, which is a hot topic these days, and we know lack of outdoor exposure will exacerbate mental health. Have we linked our eye health? Huge prevalence on eye health because of lack of outdoor exposure. So we are actually paying the price for most of us here, not the workers.
What is the link for eye health on eyes?
Lack of vitamin D. And there is evidence to say that there is a dopamine pathway that affects your eye, and therefore your eye health can also be compromised. But for the workers, right, this chronic heat exposure, not just the acute heat injury you will get, there are evidence coming from overseas. One of those things are Liling, if we don't measure, we assume it's not a problem. Until you measure, this is also a problem because it's a function of whether you bother to find in the first place. So now in Central America, and we see it happening in India and elsewhere, that they begin to see long-term exposure working in a hot environment. You may not die due to heat stroke, but you will have this condition called chronic kidney disease, and they bracket it of an unknown source or non-traditional. So not the CKD usually because you have diabetes or you get it at an older age. You have young men in their 30s, early 40s, who are now performing dialysis, often DIY dialysis back home because of the chronic heat exposure. Of course, heat is just one, and the leading hypothesis is chronic heat stress. The other confounders, they say because a lot of this worker I was just describing, they are sugarcane cutters. So they are being paid by piece. So the whole cycle, I want to cut as much as possible. And if I keep on going to the toilet, it means I will cut less. So not just the heat, I will deliberately not drink. And then you see, you have all the metabolic waste produced by hard work. You don't flush it out by hydration. And then over weeks, over months, over years, right? You pay the price. And the more obvious case was probably during the building of the World Cup stadiums. A lot of migrant workers were in Qatar. Many died. Those who didn't die, many are now back home performing dialysis. We are still uncovering what are the acute and chronic implications of working in a hot environment.
Thank you so much, Associate Professor Dr. Jason Lee, Director of the Heat Resilience and Performance Center at the Yong School of Medicine. And a big thanks as well to our listeners and the team behind this podcast, Tiffany Ang, Joanne Chan, Junaini Johari, Saye Wind, and Crispina Robert. We'll see you again next week along with Jack Board, who will be back from vacation. Until then, I'm Liling Tan. Bye for now.